Martha lay quietly in the hospital bed, reclining on the pillows. Today had been a good day, not too painful. She knew she only had a few days left, but she could still talk, and thankfully, she wasn't too uncomfortable. At the other end of the room sat Rachel and Paul, as well as her husband's brother, Daniel. They were talking quietly, giving her some rest. There were always several family members in the room with Martha, as there had been for the past few weeks. She glanced at the clock. It was a little after 2. She was looking forward to Max's arrival. He came every day around 2 o'clock and sat with her until she fell asleep for the night. He would read to her, talk to her, or just sit quietly with her, holding her hand in his, offering her water if she was thirsty. She was grateful for his calm, loving presence by her side for so many hours each day. Now, with so little time left, the happiest moment of each day was his arrival. The door swung open, and Max appeared, but with an expression on his face like she had never seen before. The cold tension shocked and frightened her. He walked right up to her bed and stopped, looking down at her. She reached out to take his hand, but he ignored her. "You slut," he said quietly, his voice sounding like a low growl in the silence of the room. "You goddamn whore!" A smile froze on her face. She couldn't respond. The look in his eyes frightened her. Across the room, Rachel, Paul, and Daniel were looking at him anxiously. "Daddy, what's wrong?" Rachel asked. He paid no attention to her, looking only at Martha. "You slept with 21 other men? You let me raise 4 other people's children as my own? You dirtied our marriage bed for 45 years? And now you're asking me to forgive you? You destroy me. Tell me our whole life has been a lie and ask me to forgive you." His voice was rising, its strained sound giving away his pain. "Max, honey," she began in a trembling voice. "You selfish, malicious slut!" he shouted, keeping his eyes on her. She began to cry. He brought his face close to hers. "I will never forgive you. Hope. You'll burn in hell. Fuck!" He stared at her for another moment, watching her cry, her hand reaching for him again. Then very carefully, he spat in her face. Without another word, he turned toward the door. The others rushed forward. "Dad? What the hell?" Rachel said, shocked. Max's brother Daniel grabbed him by the shoulder and turned him around. "Max! What are you doing?" he exclaimed. Max looked his brother in the face again. "You bastard!" he screamed. He punched Daniel's head with his fist as hard as he could, caught him by the cheek, and pulled him to his knees. Max walked quickly to the door, opened it, and disappeared, leaving a stunned silence behind him. There was Martha sobbing on the bed. Rachel walked over to her and picked up a rag to wipe the drool from her face. "Mom, are you okay? What made Daddy act like that?" But Martha didn't answer. When Rachel looked into her eyes, Martha couldn't bear it and turned away silently, continuing to cry. After a moment, Rachel looked at Paul and Daniel. "Stay with her," she said. Then she ran out of the room after her father. She ran out of the hospital, looking around, out of breath. She saw Max sitting on a bench near the entrance with his arms around his head. She walked over to him and sat down next to him. "Daddy, why were you being so cruel just now? She's dying, Daddy. What were you thinking?" She tried to keep the anger out of her voice, but the worry was obvious. He turned to her, all the anger gone from his face. He looked old, haggard, and terribly sad. Without a word, he held out Martha's letter to her. She started to read it, then aghast, and stared at him in shock. She looked at the letter again, reread it, and squeezed his hand tightly. "Papa, are you saying you didn't know? You didn't know that that we weren't really your children? But she said you knew everything. She told us we weren't supposed to discuss it with you." Max looked at her intently. He adored all his children. His children. He supposed he couldn't even call them that now, but he felt closer to Rachel, his baby girl, his last precious little girl. "Honey," he said with despair in his voice, She lied to you. Everything. I didn't know anything about it until an hour ago. Then he suddenly turned away from her, wrapped his arms around his head again, and cried. She put her arms around him, put her head on his shoulder, and cried too. The church was almost full. More than 600 people had come to pay their respects. They sat in silence, listening to Father Martin lead the service. The usual prayers were mixed with words of praise for Martha Franklin, her love and devotion to her family, her generosity to the community. There was a soft cry of surprise as Max rose from the front row and approached Father Martin. With tightly compressed lips and a reluctant look, Father Martin stepped aside and sat down, giving him a seat at the podium. Max began to speak, slowly and clearly, in a loud and sonorous voice. I know it's unusual for someone other than a priest to speak at a funeral, but I insisted. I made it clear to Father Martin and my family that if I could not speak, there would be no funeral. I am the husband of the deceased, and that is my right. Max heard the whispers, saw the people in the pews look over at each other. He continued, You've all heard that Martha was a wonderful wife and mother, a pillar of the community. Now I'll tell you the truth. Martha and I were married in this church 45 years ago. Some of you were here the day we vowed to be faithful to each other, forsaking all others for the rest of our lives. My wife has broken her vows to me here before God. She has betrayed me. She has committed adultery hundreds, if not thousands of times. She has borne children to 4 other men and allowed me unknowingly to raise them as my own. A rumble of shocked whispers filled the church. A few feet away from Max sat Father Martin, tense and unhappy. And Max continued, drowning out the whispers with his voice. Martha lied to my family members, making them complicit in hiding the truth from me. She told them all that I willingly allowed her to fornicate with other men. My own mother and father. Here Max choked and had to stop for a moment. There was silence in the church again. My own mother and father went to their graves believing that I had knowingly allowed my wife to cheat on me, allowed other men to have children with her. For 45 years I knew none of this. But Father Martin, Max exclaimed, last week forced Martha to write me a letter revealing her heinous sins against me and against God. Instead of allowing me to end my life with happy memories of a loving, faithful wife, he insisted that she destroy my peace of mind with her confession. Father Martin sat motionless, pressing his lips tightly together and staring into nothing. This man, this man of God who had never had a wife or children, does he know what it is to be a devoted husband? Does he know what it's like to find out that the children you adore more than life are not yours? And yet, in his blind, thoughtless arrogance, he made sure that Martha compounded her many sins with the ultimate sin, making me bitterly aware of the empty lies of my marriage. A silence ensued. Father Martin felt the eyes of the parishioners on him. His legs began to tremble, and he pressed his hands on them to keep them still. Max's voice grew quieter. But Martha wasn't the only adulteress. She betrayed me with 21 men, most of them married, some of them friends of mine. I now know 12 of their names, and in this place of God, may they now stand before him and answer for their sins. In a serious voice, Max read out the list from a card he pulled from his pocket. The names sounded like the ringing of a bell in the vast space of the church. Raymond Hunt, Arthur Foster, Ben Newton, Henry Appleby, Brian Spencer, Peter Thomaston, John Garner, Nicholas Menzies, Richard Harper, Robert Henderson, Barry Jones. The congregation fidgeted, looking around. Several men sat in the church with frozen and pale faces. Some of them had wives or children looking on in horror. Max saved one name for last, and Daniel Franklin, my own brother. The church filled with whispers again, full of shock and horror. Max stood tall and silent until the noise died down. Father Martin told Martha that I must forgive her so she can go to heaven. I don't know what God in his infinite wisdom will decide, but my wife is dead and will be buried without my forgiveness. Slowly, formally, Max stepped away from the podium. He headed toward the center aisle of the church. As he passed the coffin with his wife, he stopped. He looked at the huge porcelain vase filled with beautiful blue and white flowers that stood on the casket. Then, with a wave of his hand, he dropped it to the floor. The vase shattered with a clatter that echoed throughout the church for several long seconds. Max walked down the aisle to the back of the church. As he passed the second row, his daughter Rachel stood up. Taking him under her arm, she walked with him. They opened the door and walked out. As the echo of their footsteps faded into the distance, an oppressive silence filled the crowded church.